All right, well, welcome back to our Genesis study, and we're in session 11. And last week we talked about Isaac. We talked about what a transitional character he was, how really there's not a lot about him compared to his father Abraham or his son Jacob. And so we're going to get again kind of situated at a point in Isaac's life that deals with the differences between his two sons, Jacob and Esau. And so we're in Genesis chapter 25, and we're going to be in verse 27. You can see that on my Bible on the screen where we're at. And so we're going to start, and the lesson today is a contrast. We're going to have 2 weeks on Jacob. The first one is just going to be a contrast between he and Esau. We want those two characters to be really distinct when we start talking about them, because this you're going to see great differences between them, great flaws in both of them, but great differences between them. And then whenever we get to the point where Jacob becomes Israel, we're really going to see a change in his life and how he grows. Well, we're going to start. And if you remember last week, right above this, in verse 24, actually verse 22, Rebecca has the children struggling within her. And the Lord is inquired, and he says, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. You shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. And we remember last week that it seems that Isaac did not get that memo, or either he had a better idea, maybe he thought, than the younger being chief of the older. He maybe he just thought, that that was a suggestion, not a command. Maybe it was just there as a prophecy or something. But we're about to see that there are some real issues here with Isaac and his treatment of the boys. So, verse 27, we're going to start this week. When the boys grew up, and so this is talking about when they become grown men. Now, remember, 15 years of their life, they are the grandsons of a living grandfather Abraham. The last 15 years of Abraham's life, both these boys were running around, causing trouble, and, probably getting grandpa worked up at times. And so Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. And so you have this idea in our culture, Southern American culture, that a hunter is kind of like a man's man. He's an alpha male. He takes what he wants. Hunter is seen as somebody, it's kind of positive. They're rugged, they're tough, and then they know how to provide for people. Well, in the Bible, it's a little different. We have a story in Genesis. Earlier in Genesis, there's a guy named Nimrod. Now, let me get the reference for you, because I'm not going to turn my Bible app here on the screen there. And this in Genesis 10, verse 8, Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. That whole idea of being a hunter before the Lord, many scholars believe that the Hebrew kind of intimates that before the Lord is really like against the Lord. It's like a mighty hunter raising his fist against the Lord, saying, "I'm not going to, tend this land. I'm not going to work a garden. I'm going to go out and kill these animals and use that for my meat." Now, we lawfully can eat animals. That is something given to humans after the flood. And so it's not unlawful, but this whole idea of being against the Lord as a mighty hunter after the flood. It's like Nimrod is living as a rebel without a cause. That's what some Hebrew scholars say is kind of intended there. And so, in their mind, a hunter, one who mainly lives that way, it's not always a positive thing. And you can think of this in our culture. We have that as a very positive thing, but we also think the same thing of farmers. Like farmers are just good people. Well, once again, we're dealing with our culture's assumptions, but in the biblical worldview, a farmer or a tender of figs or someone who worked off the land or raised animals was viewed more favorably than someone who went out into the wilds and hunted for a living. And so when we see that Esau was a hunter, um, there's a little bit more being talked about there. He's just a wild man who kind of plays by his own rules. He goes off into the wilds and takes what he wants and doesn't really have much use for civilization. And then the next line says that Jacob was a quiet man dwelling in tents. Now, once again, a little bit of Hebrew helps here, and many commentators say that whenever it's talking about a quiet man, we think of him like a mild-mannered introvert. But the word in Hebrew can mean more like complete or fully formed or civil. Remember when God and his two angels came to Abraham's tent before they were going to Sodom and Gomorrah? And Abraham came out from the tent, invited them for dinner, had his servant cook for them, had Sarah make some bread. You think about that. Abraham was the perfect host to God and his angels, but he was also acting like that quiet man dwelling in a tent. I don't think that we take this and make Jacob timid, because the Hebrew is more like he is a diplomat. He's a person who can sit and talk with people around a social setting, whereas Esau is too wild. Esau, maybe, and I'm speculating here, maybe whenever, Abraham and then later Isaac would have these dignitaries over from different cities to discuss trade and wells and security, Jacob might have been right there watching, saying, okay, look how grandfather Abraham is poised. Look at how dignified he is. Look at the respect he commands. Look at my father Isaac. He commands respect. He's powerful. He knows how to talk well and be humble to people, but also project power. And he's learning that type of behavior, how to be a sophisticated, complete, head of a household. And Esau might have been sitting there going, this is boring. I could put an arrow in all these guys. I could cut their throats before they even knew what hit them. Why are we sitting here talking to them? I'll just go out of the well and take it by force. So we have two competing views of life here. Esau is rugged, but he's also a little uncivilized. And Jacob is quieter, more civil, more tame, but he's also more tactful. And so in verse 28, Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. It's fairly interesting the reason Isaac loves Esau. It's not because he sees in Esau, this man will carry on our family to the next generation. No, he likes to eat what Esau brings in from the fields. So there's our first little hint that perhaps Isaac is not thinking clearly or faithfully about his eldest son. Rebekah, who we know was told by God that the older would serve the younger, she loves Jacob, and Rebekah's been a good judge of character. She's been a faithful woman, and so her love for Jacob is not just her being a mom, like him being a mama's boy and her being overprotective. I think in him she sees a more stable future for the clan, for the family, for the enterprise. And so the next story right after this is really, it's amazing. If you read verse 29 to 34, it shows you so much about Esau's character. First, he's a hunter and a wild man, not a good thing. But the second part is he hates the idea of having this birthright where he has to follow in Isaac's footsteps, just like Grandpa Abraham. He does not value that. So take a minute and read verse 29 through 34, and then we're going to walk through it. All right, since you've looked through that, Jacob was cooking stew one day, and here we have this idea of him sitting around, with the women. But it men in all cultures, if they can cook a good stew, that's a manly thing. Um, there's a guy I know who cooks like a beanless Texas chili. It's not tomato based. I mean, it is a awesome soup, and it's a man's soup. I mean, it's just like all this beef in it and stuff. And when he brings that out, at men's parties, like at wild game banquets and stuff, like men gather around and eat. Like it's one of these things. We sit here and we look at Jacob cooking stew, and Esau comes in from the field exhausted, and he wants the stew. So it's not that Jacob's being a mama's boy; he just knows how to cook. So we don't read into it some type of effeminacy. We just know that Jacob knew how to run a house, knew how to run a small, or medium size, because we talk about how rich Abraham and Isaac were, a big, like, herd-based economy. He knew how to run that. He knew how to cook a mean pot of chili. And so Esau comes in from the field. He's been out hunting. He's been out doing whatever, and he's about, starved to death, not even taking care of himself. Esau says to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, or I'm exhausted." And so they give him the nickname Red, Edom. And what's funny about this is Jacob's response. Jacob says, "Well, sell me your birthright now." And Esau, "I'm about to die. What use is that to me?" He just despises it. He doesn't care. And so Jacob kind of pushed him a little further, says, "Well, swear to me now." So he swears to him. And Jacob gives Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose, and he laughed again. He despises his birthright. Notice he did not go to his parents and say, your younger son is trying to steal my birthright. I need some soup. I mean, he's a rich child. He's a rich man. He could get his own soup. The point of this story is not that he's been it's not that he's been forced under duress to get rid of it. It's just that it was the easy way out for him. He might have been starving, but could have got food somewhere else. He just despised the idea that he would follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather. And so we see here another negative thing about Esau. He's a wild man, and he does not care about God's plan for himself. He just, I mean, it's pretty wild, because we've got this idea that Jacob is a swindler, and he was sneaky. But we don't need to miss the fact that Esau was a deeply flawed person. Well, we're in chapter 26 now, and I want you to think about the third point here now we're going to talk about with Esau. Then verse 34 of 26, when Esau was 40 years old, he took Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, to be his wife, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac and Rebekah do not like Esau's wives. He took godless women. And now, remember, Isaac had heard his father send away a servant to get him a good wife. So Isaac had not followed Abraham's example to get Esau a good wife from his kin in Padam Aram. He did not make sure that Esau knew the plan. And so Esau takes these wives from the local inhabitants of Canaan, and he basically, like I said, it's just that he's kind of thinking, I don't have to live my life a certain way. I don't want to follow God's plan. So That's really the third negative against Esau. And it's not just that he did that, but they are not good women. They make his parents miserable. So now we get to the, I would say, the end all be all of Esau. What are we gonna say about his view of God's blessing on his family? Well, he has a very low view of God's blessing. He does not cherish it. He does not want it. In fact, as the Bible said, he despised his birthright. So we just know that drawing from those three weaknesses, we know that Esau's view about God's plan for him, he didn't want it. So now let's talk about Jacob. And as I said earlier, Jacob was uh, Jacob was a civilized guy. Um, Jacob was a diplomat, and Jacob was also not just on those things, but tolerable to his parents. He didn't live in a way to drive them crazy. Read with me real quick in 27:46 on the screen here, and this is after the boys, you know, after they get into a big fight, Jacob steals the blessing. But in verse 46, then Rebekah said to Isaac, I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be to me? So there is something wrong with the way this is all going. Um, Esau has ruined his family, even though Isaac wants his food. Esau is not a good guy. Um, so closing up, he's moving to Jacob. So Jacob's complete and civilized. And Jacob actually covets Esau's birthright. And you can see from the story with the soup, um, he wants God's blessing. He wants that birthright. Maybe his mother had been telling him his whole life, you know what God told me, that you will have it one day, not your brother. So he covets that birthright. He probably esteems it rightfully as a good thing, but there's probably some sinful covetousness too, and has a great relationship with his family. That's the third, positive. Number one, civilized diplomat. Two, covets the birthright. Number three, good relationship with his mom and dad. We don't get the idea that Isaac doesn't like Jacob. It's just that he loves what Esau cooks for him. So Jacob has a very high view of God's blessing, of the power of that promise and that blessing. And so we've got the two boys now kind of analyzed. They're opposites. They don't like each other. They use each other for what they want. Now, Jacob is deceptive. He learned well from his dad and his grandfather, who were deceptive. So we've got this this scene that's going to be set up now, where Isaac is going to bless Jacob. And so, if you would, you can pause me and read chapter 27. And it's a bit of a story. You can quit in verse 45 because we read verse 46 about the Hittite women. But go ahead and read and pause, and then we'll come back and discuss it. All right, so we're back. We're talking about chapter 27, and I just want to make a couple of statements about Isaac here. Because last week I gave you some discussion, some homework, and I said, did Isaac know what was going on? Or was he completely in the dark? Or did he just reject what God had told his wife, Rebecca? So the Bible tells us a couple of things we know for sure. Number one is that Isaac loves Esau, but he loves him because of the food he prepares for him. He loves wild game. And so Esau's out hunting. And like I said, it's not like we think of hunting, like being self-reliant and tough. It's kind of just being wild, not wanting to play by society's rules. And Isaac loves the food though. And but he hates his wives. He hates Esau's wives. They make his life miserable. Well, we get to this point where Isaac is old. Um, I believe here he's like 113 years old. And I could be a little bit wrong on math. I'm trying to remember from my notes. And so he's going to live for a while longer, blind as an old man, but um, he's blind. He doesn't know how much longer he's going to live. And verse 1, his eyes were dim so that he could not see. He called Esau, his older son, and said to him, my son. He answered, here am I. Here I am. He said, behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver, your bow, and go out of the field and hunt game for me. Prepare for me delicious food, such as I love, and bring it to me so that I may eat, that my soul may bless you before I die. There's some speculation here and some commentaries that Isaac had gotten so, say the word, his appetites had taken control of his better judgment. He wanted that food. He wanted that wild game. He was only thinking of his appetite, not the purposes of God here. Whether we read that much into it or not, I'm unaware of how that changes the outcome. Either way, whether he's just hungry or whether his appetites are just taking control of him, he wants his son to go out and get that food, and then he's going to give him the blessing. Now, Isaac is completely passive and reactive in this scene. He just wants food and he's waiting there for it. He's blind. Now, we have to think, if Isaac knew of God's promise to Rebekah that the older would serve the younger, then he's rebelling against God's plan. Now, if for some reason he didn't know, then we just say God's plan took him by surprise. But I think since they didn't like Esau's wives and they knew Esau was a wild man and Jacob was the one who could run the enterprise, I tend to think that Isaac just wanted Esau to have it. It was kind of like the tradition, and he was going to give it to him. And he wasn't really thinking along the strategic, faith-filled, long-term view of things. I think this puts Isaac in the place where he wants to try to do God's plan, almost like the time that Abraham marries Hagar to try to do God's plan for him, since Sarah's like, well, I can't have kids. And remember from that story, what happened is God still fixed it. And God's about to fix it in this one. So Esau goes out and he hunts, and he's out in the field. And while he's gone, this happens. Verse 5, Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau. Bring me game and prepare for me delicious food that I may eat it and bless you before the Lord before I die. And she tells him, go and basically get goats and I'll prepare them and trick your father. So she's going to trick him that way. But you're going to, then Jacob has an idea. He's like, wait a minute, Esau's hairy and I'm smooth. What if he finds out? So Rebekah has another idea to deceive. She puts Esau's clothes on Jacob and the skins of the young goats. So not only is she tricking Isaac with food, but she's tricking him with the clothing on his son Jacob. Now, let's skip down And let's go to verse 24. And this is Isaac. He says, "Are you really my son Esau?" But he notices Jacob's voice, two verses above. "Are you really my son Esau?" He answered, "I am." And he said, "Bring it near to me that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it near to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. And his father Isaac said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him, and Isaac smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, "See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed." And he goes out and he gives him the blessing. And right when Jacob leaves, in comes Esau. And Isaac is completely tricked. So I think Isaac really was tricked. I don't think, now he might have doubted at first, but then it's like, okay, he got, his better judgment kicked in, but he really got tricked. And so in verse 33, Isaac trembled very violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I blessed him. Yes, and he shall be blessed." As soon as Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." So now Esau wants the blessing. Now he wants the birthright. Did something change? Or was it, as he got older, he just realized this is important? Or was it just jealousy? We don't know. But we know he took the birthright and he took the blessing. And now Esau is just stuck. And so he gives him a second blessing, but it's not the same. And look at this blessing in verse 39. "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck." So he's a wild man, and he's going to be wilder. That's Isaac's blessing on him. Verse 41, "Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, 'The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob.' But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, 'Behold, your brother Esau comforts himself about you by planning to kill you. And therefore, my son, obey my voice, arise and flee to Laban, my brother, in Haran.'" So the third thing Rebekah does in this story is she once again intervenes, not to disguise food and not to disguise the son, but to hide the son. So she hides Jacob by sending him to her family. And we sit back and we look and we go, this is probably one of the most dysfunctional family scenes that we have yet seen in the Bible. The end of Lot's life is pretty weird, and the end of Noah's life is kind of weird, but this overshadows those. So Isaac is going to live for many more years after this. But we know that he's blind and kind of bedridden. And so Jacob runs before Isaac dies so that he's not murdered by his brother. Now let's talk the last thing about the blessing. The blessing. And you know that the blessing in this story, it's not just a passive thing. It is an active, living thing. When it's given to somebody, it's like the energy of God works for that person in a certain way. Also, it's not replaceable. Isaac only had one blessing to give, and when he gave it, it was gone. He had to give a different blessing to Esau after that, because Jacob had taken the good one. And then the last thing to think about it is the blessing, which was first given to Abraham, then Isaac, which is the child of the promise. It is not given by the order of birth. If that was the case, then Ishmael would have got it because he was actually Abraham's firstborn son, but Isaac was the son of the promise. Jacob was the secondborn son, but he was the son that God chose for that blessing to go to, not Esau. And now we can say, well, it's because Esau despised it. Well, Jacob had his flaws too. We know that from other parts in the Bible, there's a verse, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And in Romans chapter 9, Paul talks about God's sovereign choice. God can do with his blessings what he wants to, give them to who he wants to. It's not dependent on conditions he sees. God's free in regard to what he blesses and what he doesn't bless. Romans 9 is very clear that it's not because Esau was worse than Jacob or Jacob was less bad than Esau. Romans 9, in fact, it says it was made before the boys had done anything. And that's what's so tough about reading the story, because Romans 9 says, verse 11, though they were not yet born and had done nothing, either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. God had a plan, and he wanted Jacob to be the one to carry on that promise. We see the flaws in Esau, but God could have worked to change those flaws, just as he worked to change the flaws in Jacob, as he changed his name eventually to Israel. This was just God's plan. So we're going to wrap up the lesson now, and just we're going to leave it kind of open, because now Jacob's running and we don't know what's going to happen, because here we have this deceptive thief with God's blessing running. And it's one of those things where you just go, wow, what is God doing? Isaac lied about his wife being his sister and said Abraham, but this seems a lot worse. But we're going to see what happens next week is going to be about Jacob and his transformation to Israel. And after that, we've got two more lessons. One about Joseph and the start of his life, and then one about the end of Joseph's life. So we've got 3 lessons left till we get to the end. I'm also catching up on some of the earlier lessons. I think lesson 5 will be posted later this week, and 6, and then I'm going to try to do 7 and 8. Maybe it's just 7. I think I got the 8, or 7 and 8 the next weeks. Next week, we're going to get into one of the most difficult sections of Genesis to deal with, and that's this idea of Jacob wrestling with God. Just a great view of how God has been just meeting with humans, eating in their tent, involving them in the plan of redemption as he deals with cities, telling them, about their kids before they've been born. And now he's going to wrestle one of them. Just the way God deals with these patriarchs and deals with us is just refreshing, because, we've all been there. We've all lived a life where, especially right now, we don't know what's going to happen, but we're trusting God's plan even when we don't see it. So thank you for following along. And if there's any questions, leave them in the comment or email me, and we'll see you next week.